Sharp suits. Razor-lined caps. The Shelby family, ruling 1920s Birmingham with ambition and fear. You know the story. You love the characters. The slow-motion walks through industrial hellscapes, the whiskey-soaked deals in the Garrison pub, the rise of a traumatized soldier to a criminal emperor and member of parliament. It's one of the most stylish and iconic sagas ever put on television. But what if I told you almost all of it is a lie? The real Peaky Blinders didn't use razors in their caps, their heyday wasn't the 1920s, and the most famous Peaky Blinder of them all never even existed. Today, we're separating fact from fiction and exposing the biggest lies Hollywood told you about the Peaky Blinders. So, by order of the historian, let's get to it. Lie number 1: the razor blade caps. Let's start with the most famous lie, the one that gives the gang its name in the show and has become their defining image, the razor blade sewn into the peak of a flat cap. It's a terrifyingly brilliant idea for a weapon. A casual headbutt turns into a gruesome attack, slashing an opponent's forehead and blinding them with blood. It's a signature move we see the Shelbys use to devastating effect. It's also pure fiction. According to historian Carl Chinn, who has dedicated his life to researching the real gangs of Birmingham, there is absolutely no historical evidence that the gang ever used razors this way. He's scoured countless police records and newspaper archives, and the iconic weapon is nowhere to be found. The myth was popularized by a 1977 novel called A Walk Down Summer Lane by John Douglas, a fictional story that romanticized the idea. The show's creator, Stephen Knight, grabbed that powerful image and ran with it, cementing a piece of fiction into popular fact. There are a couple of very practical reasons why this weapon makes no sense for the real gang. First, disposable safety razor blades were a new and expensive luxury item when the gang was actually active. The real Peaky Blinders were at their peak in the 1890s, and these items would have been far too costly for poor, working-class street thugs to waste as weapons. They would have relied on much cheaper straight razors, or cutthroats, which would be impossible to sew into the soft brim of a cap. And, as Carl Chinn points out, it's just not a very practical weapon. Think about it. How do you effectively wield a flimsy blade sewn into a soft cap with enough force and precision to do serious damage? A hard man from that era would tell you it's a clumsy and ineffective way to fight. You'd be more likely to cut your own fingers just trying to handle it. So what did they use? Their weapons were much more brutal and way less elegant. The real Peaky Blinders were known for using steel-toed boots, heavy leather belts with thick buckles, knives, and simple, readily available weapons like stones and bricks. They were street brawlers, and their methods were crude, direct, and terrifyingly effective without any hidden blades. So where did the name Peaky Blinders come from, if not from the razors? The truth is a lot simpler. Peaky just referred to the popular style of flat cap they wore. And blinder was common Birmingham slang at the time for someone who was dapper or striking in appearance. So, a Peaky Blinder was basically just a sharply dressed guy in a peaked cap. Another theory suggests they'd sneak up on victims and pull the cap's peak down over their eyes to obscure their vision before robbing them. Either way, the razors had nothing to do with it. The show took a bit of slang and a fictional idea and merged them into an unforgettable, but completely fabricated, calling card. Lie number 2: the timeline and amp. The Shelby Empire. This next lie is arguably even bigger than the razor blades. The show's entire premise is built on a historically inaccurate foundation. The series kicks off in 1919, with the Shelby brothers returning from the horrors of World War I to build a criminal empire that stretches through the 1920s and into the 30s. They become kings of Birmingham, controlling horse racing, bootlegging, and eventually wielding political power. The problem? The real Peaky Blinders were already a spent force by then. The historical Peaky Blinders were not a post-World War I phenomenon, they were a Victorian-era gang. Their main reign of terror was in the 1890s. The first newspaper mention of the Peaky Blinders appeared in March 1890 after a brutal assault. They hit their peak in that decade, a full 30 years before the show even starts. By the 1910s, their influence was already fading, and by the time Tommy Shelby is supposedly returning from France, the real Peaky Blinders had been largely displaced from Birmingham's streets. As historian Carl Chinn bluntly puts it, there were no Peaky Blinders in the 1920s. The show gives us a sophisticated, hierarchical criminal organization run by battle-hardened men in their late 20s and 30s. The reality was much less grand. The real Peaky Blinders weren't a single, unified gang, but a generic term for numerous street gangs of young men. And I do mean young. Police records show members like David Taylor being arrested at age 13, and others like Harry Fowler and Ernest Bales at just 19. They were mostly teenagers, not seasoned war veterans. The criminal enterprise was also a far cry from the empire on screen. They weren't fixing horse races or negotiating with Winston Churchill. They were street-level thugs engaged in petty crime, robbery, and brutal street fights with rival gangs like the Cheapside Sloggers over scraps of territory. Their activities were assault, illegal bookmaking, and local protection rackets. They were notorious in their own neighborhoods, but they were never the all-powerful syndicate the show imagines. Police records describe them as foul-mouthed young men who stalked the streets in drunken groups, insulting and mugging passers-by. The gang that did rise to prominence in Birmingham in the 1920s was a different entity, the Birmingham Boys, led by a man named Billy Kimber. The Peaky Blinders had been pushed out and overtaken long before. So, the show takes the name and reputation of a 19th century gang and transplants them into the 20th century, giving them the power of a completely different group. It's like making a movie about 1960s rock and roll but claiming the biggest band was a group of Civil War-era folk singers. The timeline is the single greatest fabrication of the series. Lie number 3, the man himself, Tommy Shelby. So, if the timeline is wrong and the razors are a myth, surely the magnetic, brilliant, and tortured leader of the gang, Thomas Shelby, must be real, right? He feels too specific, too complex to be entirely made up. Wrong again. Tommy Shelby, along with his brothers Arthur and John, and the entire Shelby family, are complete fiction. There was no Shelby crime family that ruled Birmingham. The show's creator, Stephen Knight, has been open about inventing the family, inspired by his parents' stories about powerful, well-dressed gangsters from their childhood. While there were some violent families involved in gangs, there was no single, dominant dynasty like the Shelbys. The real gangs were much more fluid, without a central figurehead like Tommy. However, while Tommy is fictional, some of the characters he runs into are very real, most notably his first major rival, Billy Kimber. But here again, the show completely flips the script. In the series, Tommy's gang crushes Billy Kimber and his Birmingham Boys, cementing the Peaky Blinders as the dominant force. In reality, the exact opposite happened. Billy Kimber was the real powerhouse. He led the far more powerful and organized Birmingham Boys. It was Kimber's gang, not the Peaky Blinders, that dominated the lucrative racecourse rackets in the 1920s and became one of the most feared gangs in England. The real Peaky Blinders had clashed with Kimber's rising force and lost. The show takes the man who actually beat the Peaky Blinders and makes him a stepping stone for its fictional hero. Other real-life figures pop up too. Darby Sabini, the London-based Italian gangster, was a real crime boss who controlled rackets in Clerkenwell. Alfred Solomon, the Camden-based Jewish gang leader memorably played by Tom Hardy, was inspired by a real gangster named Alfred Solomon. And historical records show these real figures, Kimber, Sabini, and Solomon, were the ones clashing for control. In 1921, the real Alfred Solomon was arrested for shooting the real Billy Kimber. The Peaky Blinders weren't even in the picture. So, while there was no Tommy Shelby, there was a man believed to be a prominent figure among the original Peaky Blinders, Thomas Gilbert, who also went by Kevin Mooney. But he was a street fighter from the 1890s, not a post-war mastermind. He was one of many hard men in a sea of street gangs, a far cry from the schemer and industrialist Tommy Shelby becomes. Lie number 4. The glamour versus the gritty reality. One of the show's biggest draws is its style. The Shelbys are portrayed as exceptionally well dressed, walking in slow motion with an air of menace and sophistication. They're anti-heroes, violent criminals, sure, but they often fight for family honor and take on more corrupt enemies, all with a roguish charm. This romanticized, gentleman gangster is a cornerstone of the series. The reality of the Peaky Blinders was anything but glamorous. They were products of extreme poverty, living in the overcrowded and unsanitary slums of industrial Birmingham. Their lives weren't about expensive suits and strategic meetings. They were about desperation, brutality, and survival. While they did dress with a certain flair to stand out, it was a working-class statement, not high fashion. They wore tailored jackets, bell-bottom trousers, silk scarves, and their signature caps, but this was in the context of grimy, violent streets. The look was meant to signal menace, turning their poverty into a uniform of aggression. More importantly, the show sanitizes their violence. Tommy's family often directs their aggression toward rival gangs or powerful enemies, positioning them as underdogs. The real Peaky Blinders were not noble outlaws. According to Carl Chinn, they were vicious thugs who primarily preyed on the innocent and vulnerable in their own communities. They bullied the poor, extorted local shopkeepers, and engaged in random, extreme violence. They were notorious for constable baiting, which meant deliberately attacking police officers, leading to the deaths of constables like George Snipe in 1897 and Charles Gunter in 1901. They were known to rob and beat ordinary people, terrorizing the very neighborhoods they lived in. There's a documented case of them hospitalizing a man just for ordering a non-alcoholic ginger beer. These were not anti-heroes. They were, in Chinn's words, vicious, violent thugs, who were not meant to be admired. The mugshots of real members tell the true story. You don't see the chiseled jaw of Cillian Murphy. You see grimy, sullen-faced teenagers and young men arrested for petty crimes like stealing a bicycle. You see boys like Harry Fowles, Ernest Bales, and Stephen McNichol, described in court reports as foul-mouthed young men. One of the first individuals named as a Peaky Blinder, Henry Lightfoot, was a career criminal who died in poverty. There was no glamour, only the brutal reality of life in the slums. Lie number 5. Their rise and fall in the world of the show. The Peaky Blinders are always on the up. They start small, but through Tommy's ruthless strategy, they conquer Birmingham, take on London, and evolve into a transatlantic empire with political influence at the highest levels. Their story is one of constant winning. The historical truth is a story of decline. The real Peaky Blinders didn't rise into an empire, they faded away. Their downfall wasn't a climactic gang war, but a slow death caused by a few key factors. First, they were simply outmatched by rivals. As we mentioned, Billy Kimber's Birmingham boys grew more powerful, pushing the Peaky Blinders out of the lucrative racecourse rackets and taking control of the city's underworld in the early 20th century. The Peaky Blinders basically lost the gang war for Birmingham before the TV show even starts. Second, and maybe more importantly, was a major police crackdown and a shift in society. A key figure in their demise was an Irish police chief named Sir Charles Horton Rafter, appointed in 1899. Rafter was determined to clean up Birmingham's streets. He beefed up the police force and pushed for harsher sentencing, ensuring that assaults on police were met with serious jail time. Crucially, Rafter's efforts also helped build working-class confidence in the police. For decades, people in the slums were too afraid to testify against the gangs. But by the early 1900s, ordinary citizens began to feel safe enough to give evidence, breaking the gang's power. Finally, social progress played a huge role. Compulsory schooling, youth clubs, and the growing popularity of sports like boxing gave young boys an alternative to gang life. It offered them discipline, purpose, and a path out of the slums that didn't involve crime. So, the Peaky Blinders didn't go out in a blaze of glory. They just became obsolete. They were a product of Victorian poverty and lawlessness, and they couldn't survive in a 20th century world with a stronger police force, empowered communities, and more social opportunities. They simply fizzled out. So, to recap the biggest lies, the iconic razor cap. A myth from a novel. The 1920s criminal empire. They were a Victorian street gang that was gone by then. The charismatic leader Tommy Shelby. A complete work of fiction. The glamorous anti-heroes. They were brutal thugs who preyed on the poor. And their dramatic rise to power. In reality, they were defeated by rivals and faded into obscurity. Does this make the show bad? Absolutely not. Peaky Blinders is a masterpiece of television, a stunning work of historical fiction that uses a real name and place as a jumping-off point for a gripping story about family, trauma, and ambition. It was never meant to be a documentary. Creator Stephen Knight took the myths from his childhood and crafted a modern epic. But the real story, stripped of the glamour, is just as fascinating. It's a story about the harsh realities of industrial poverty, the evolution of urban crime, and the societal forces that shape our world. It reveals that the fight against crime isn't always won with a gun battle, but often through the slow, steady progress of policing, community courage, and social reform. While Hollywood gave us the fantasy of Tommy Shelby, history gives us the gritty, complex, and ultimately more human story of the real Peaky Blinders. So what do you think? Were you surprised by the truth behind the Peaky Blinders? Let us know in the comments. And if you enjoyed uncovering the real history behind the Hollywood myth, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the truth behind your favorite shows and movies. What historical myth should we debunk next? Thanks for watching.